Susan Sarandon stopped mid-sentence. Her eyes locked onto a face in the audience. And Jimmy Fallon, for the first time in his life, had no idea what to say. It was a Tuesday night in October 2023. The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon. Studios 6A at 30 Rockefeller Plaza. Another taping. Another celebrity interview. Another audience of 300 people expecting laughs and games and viral moments. Susan Sarandon was the guest. Oscar-winning actress. Hollywood legend. Sharp wit. Endless stories. She'd been on the show a dozen times before. She and Jimmy had an easy rapport, the kind that makes for great television. Comfortable. Professional. Fun. They were 5 minutes into the interview. Susan was telling a story about her latest film, something funny about a mishap on set. Jimmy was laughing, leaning forward with genuine amusement, his blue note cards resting on the desk beside his coffee mug. The Roots were providing occasional musical punctuation. The audience was engaged. Everything was perfect. Everything was routine. And then Susan stopped talking. Not a natural pause. Not a breath between sentences. A complete sudden stop. Her mouth closed mid-word. Her eyes, which had been looking at Jimmy, animated and full of life, went distant and fixed on something over his shoulder, toward the back of the studio audience. Jimmy noticed immediately. His smile faltered. "Susan? You okay?" She didn't respond. Didn't even acknowledge he'd spoken. She was staring at the tiered audience seating, specifically at the back rows, with an expression Jimmy had never seen on her face before, complete shock mixed with something that looked like recognition and disbelief. The audience felt the shift. The comfortable laughter died away. People began turning in their seats, trying to follow Susan's line of sight, trying to understand what had captured her attention so completely. Jimmy glanced at his cards, then back at Susan. Did you see someone?" Susan's hand rose slowly to her mouth. Her eyes were filling with tears. She nodded once, a tiny movement, still not looking away from whoever she'd spotted in the audience. Jimmy stopped mid-joke. The entire studio froze. The control room erupted into controlled chaos. Director Dave Diamadi was leaning into his monitors. "What's happening? Camera 3, can you get what she's looking at? Camera 5, stay on Susan. Don't cut away." Producer Katie Hockmeyer stood behind Dave, one hand on his shoulder. "Keep rolling. Something real is happening." On stage, Jimmy's note cards slipped from his hand and scattered across his desk, one falling to the floor. He didn't pick it up. He was staring at Susan, his jovial host expression completely gone, replaced by genuine concern. "Susan," he said softly, "who did you see?" Susan finally pulled her gaze away from the audience and looked at Jimmy. Tears were streaming down her face now, her carefully applied makeup beginning to run. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but the studio microphones caught every word. "That's my mother." The words hung in the air like a physical thing. Jimmy's eyes widened. The audience collectively leaned forward. Questlove lowered his drumsticks. "Your mother?" Jimmy repeated carefully. "Susan, your mother passed away. 7 years ago. I remember you talked about it on the show." "I know," Susan said, her voice breaking. "I know she's gone. I was there when she died. I held her hand. But Jimmy..." She pointed toward the back of the studio, her hand trembling. "That woman. In the back row. She looks exactly like her. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened 7 years earlier." Susan Sarandon's mother, Lenora Matthews, died in 2016 at the age of 94. She'd lived a full life. Raised 9 children, worked as a homemaker and later as a producer on some of Susan's early projects, spent her final years surrounded by grandchildren and great-grandchildren. But the relationship between Susan and her mother had been complicated. Lenora was old-school Italian Catholic, traditional in ways that often clashed with Susan's progressive, unconventional life choices. They'd argued about politics, about religion, about Susan's career, about her relationships. "You're too independent," Lenora used to say. "You don't need anyone. That's not how family works." "I need people on my own terms," Susan would reply. "That's not the same as not needing them." They loved each other fiercely, but they'd spent decades not quite understanding each other. And then, in the last 6 months of Lenora's life, when the cancer diagnosis came and the prognosis was measured in weeks rather than months, they'd run out of time to bridge that gap. Susan had been filming in Morocco when her sister called. "You need to come home. Mom's asking for you." Susan caught the next flight. 18 hours of travel, arriving at the hospice facility in New Jersey exhausted and terrified. Her mother was awake, lucid, painfully thin, but still with that sharp look in her eyes that Susan had known her entire life. "You came," Lenora said, her voice weak. "Of course I came, Mom. I thought you might be too busy. Too important now." It was vintage Lenora. Even dying, she couldn't help but needle her most famous daughter. But Susan heard what was underneath the words. Fear. Loneliness. The desperate hope that her daughter would stay. "I'm here," Susan said, taking her mother's hand. "I'm not going anywhere." She stayed for 3 days. Sitting beside the bed. Reading to her mother. Talking about old memories. But they never had the conversations Susan desperately wanted to have. Never addressed the decades of misunderstanding. Never found the words to bridge the gap between who Lenora wanted Susan to be and who Susan actually was. On the 3rd night, Lenora slipped into unconsciousness. Susan sat beside her, holding her hand, waiting. At 3:47 a.m., Lenora Marie Crichon took her last breath. And Susan was left with all the words she'd never said. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. The funeral was large. Lenora had 9 children, 32 grandchildren, and more great-grandchildren than anyone could easily count. The church was packed. Susan gave a eulogy that was gracious and loving and carefully avoided anything too personal. Afterward, going through her mother's things, Susan found a box of letters. Letters Lenora had written but never sent. Letters addressed to Susan, dated over 30 years, chronicling every major event in Susan's life that Lenora had watched from a distance. One letter stood out. Written 3 months before Lenora's death, never mailed. "Dear Susan, I watch you on television and I'm so proud I could burst. But I can never quite figure out how to tell you that without it sounding like criticism or surprise that you succeeded. I wish I could just say I see you and I'm proud without all the other words getting in the way. Maybe someday we'll figure out how to talk to each other. Love, Mom." Susan had broken down reading it. All those years of complicated conversations, and her mother had been struggling with the exact same thing Susan was, how to express love across a gap of misunderstanding. She'd carried that letter with her for 7 years. In her purse. A physical reminder of words that came too late, of a conversation they'd never have, of a relationship that had ended before it could be fully understood. And now, on a Tuesday night in October 2023, Susan Sarandon was staring at a woman in the back row of the Tonight Show audience who looked exactly like her mother looked 30 years ago. Behind the scenes, Fallon made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. Jimmy stood up. Not the casual standing he did for comedy bits. This was deliberate, serious. He stepped out from behind his desk and walked to where Susan sat in the guest chair, her face still turned toward the audience, tears still streaming. "Susan," he said gently, crouching beside her chair so their eyes were level. "Do you want me to talk to her? The woman you saw?" Susan looked at him, vulnerability written across her famous face. "I don't know. This is crazy. I know it's not actually her. I know my mother is gone. But she looks like her? Exactly like her. The same hair. The same way of sitting with her hands folded. The same presence." Jimmy made a decision. He looked directly at camera too. We're going to take a quick pause here. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. The show went to commercial. But the cameras didn't stop rolling. During the break, Jimmy walked into the audience. The tiered seating created natural rows of elevation, and he climbed the stairs to the back section where Susan had been looking. The audience members made way for him, sensing something important was happening. In the back row sat an elderly woman. White hair pulled back in the same style Lenora used to wear. Kind eyes behind thin-framed glasses. Hands folded in her lap. She looked up at Jimmy with a gentle, knowing expression. "Hi," Jimmy said softly. "I'm sorry to bother you. But our guest, Susan Sarandon, she saw you from the stage and—" "This is going to sound strange, but you apparently look very much like her late mother." The woman's eyes widened. "Susan Sarandon? The actress? Oh my goodness. I had no idea. I'm so sorry if I upset her." "You didn't upset her." "Well, maybe you did, but in a complicated way." Jimmy paused. "Would you mind if I asked your name?" "Lenora," the woman said. "Lenora Matthews." Jimmy actually took a step back. "Your name is Lenora?" "Yes." Does that mean something?" "That was Susan's mother's name." The woman put her hand to her chest. Oh my goodness." Jimmy looked back toward the stage where Susan was still sitting in the guest chair, being attended to by a production assistant with tissues. He looked back at Lenora Matthews. "I know this is a strange request," Jimmy said, "but would you be willing to come down to the stage? To meet Susan? I think she needs to see that you're real. That you're just a person who happens to look like someone she lost." Lenora nodded immediately. "Of course. Absolutely. But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home, ever saw coming." When they returned from commercial, Jimmy was back at his desk. Susan had composed herself somewhat, though her eyes were still red. The audience was buzzing with confused energy, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. "We're back," Jimmy said to the camera, his voice gentle. "And we're going to do something we've never done before on this show. Susan, during the break, I went and talked to the woman you saw in the audience." Susan's hands gripped the armrests of her chair. "You did? Her name is Lenora. Lenora Matthews. She's visiting New York from Pennsylvania. And she had no idea she looked like your mother. But she'd like to meet you. If that's okay." Susan's breath caught. Her name is Lenora?" "Yes." Tears started again. Susan nodded, unable to speak. Jimmy gestured to the side of the stage. Lenora Matthews walked out, moving slowly, clearly overwhelmed. She was wearing a simple cardigan and slacks, looking every bit like someone who'd won Tonight Show tickets through a radio contest and had no idea she'd end up on camera. Susan stood up. The two women faced each other. Susan Sarandon, Oscar-winning actress and Hollywood icon, and Lenora Matthews, retired schoolteacher from Pittsburgh who happened to look exactly like Susan's deceased mother. "Oh my God!" Susan whispered. "You could be her sister." Lenora smiled, that same gentle smile Lenora Crishon used to give. "I'm so sorry if seeing me upset you, dear." "You didn't." "I mean you did, but in the best way." Susan took Lenora's hands. "Can I ask you something strange?" "Of course." Susan reached into her purse, the same purse she'd kept with her all night, and pulled out the letter. The one her mother had written 7 years ago. Her hands were shaking. "My mother wrote this before she died. We never got to have certain conversations. We ran out of time. And I've been carrying this letter ever since, wishing I could tell her that I understood. That I saw her too." Lenora Matthews looked at Susan with those kind eyes, so much like Lenora Crishon's eyes, and said simply, "Then tell me. Pretend I'm her. Say what you need to say." The studio was absolutely silent. Susan took a breath. "Mom, I see you. I saw you my whole life. And I'm sorry we spent so much time not understanding each other. But I want you to know, I got it. I got the letter. And everything you wanted to say? I felt it too. Lenora Matthews pulled Susan into an embrace. This stranger. This woman who just happened to have the same name, and the same face, and showed up in the right place at the right moment. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Jimmy had the letter framed. It hangs in his office with a photo from that night, Susan and Lenora Matthews embracing on stage. Below it, a small plaque. Sometimes the universe gives you one more chance to say goodbye. Susan and Lenora stayed in touch. They meet twice a year for coffee. It's not about replacing anyone. It's about closure arriving in the most unexpected way.